Hey everybody, what's going on? This week I'm going to be trying something a little bit different. As I'm making these videos, I've realized that sometimes people have funny stories that can come across as the sort of thing that I would like to include on this channel. So I thought to start things off, let's start with one of my stories. So this happened a few years ago, either in the summer of 2018 or 2019. I was looking around on Ask Fred for some saber tournaments. Now, this was during summer, which is considered the off season for fencing, so there wasn't a whole lot there. But I noticed that there was one unsanctioned foil and saber tournament. Now, this piqued my interest mainly because it was happening at a club that I knew for a fact hosted foil and epee classes, but didn't have a saber program. So the fact that one of their events was a saber event was kind of surprising to me. But this also explained the fact that it was an unsanctioned event. Now, for those who aren't aware, unsanctioned tournaments are basically like sanctioned tournaments, except they can't give out ratings, and you are able to bend some of the smaller rules a little bit. For example, you don't necessarily need to wear fencing pants, and you don't need an extra weapon to bring to each strip. So it's recommended that you follow these things, but it's not strictly enforced. So unsanctioned tournaments are usually held as a way to help ease people who have never been in a competitive fencing environment to sort of ease the transition between them. Now, I was sort of afraid of going to this thing because I was a competitive fencer, so I didn't want to show up and have people think that I was just there to beat up on people. But then I took a look at the list, and I noticed that there were several fencers signed up for the Sabre event from a club that I'd never heard of. Essentially, it was this university's fencing club. Now, I didn't even know that this particular university had a club, but apparently they did, and several of them were coming. So I was kind of curious to see what they were like. So I eventually decided to sign up. I wanted to see what these fencers were like, and I also wanted to see how a club that doesn't have a specific saber program would handle a saber event. I didn't think it'd be a total train wreck because I happened to know the head coach, and I knew that while epee was his specialty, and he was also a very good foilist, he may have had limited saber experience, but experience in it nonetheless. So I decided to go. Now, since I'd had background foil experience, and because I was going to have to be driving for about 2 hours, or actually no, more like maybe an hour to get down there, I decided I might as well do both. So I did the foil event first. Now the foil event was pretty uneventful. I actually did a little bit better than I thought I would, because I hadn't really touched foil for a while, and I believe I made it into either the second or the third round of direct eliminations. I don't remember exactly, but I actually ended up losing right at the time that I probably should have, so that I had enough time to rest and, more importantly, make the mental transition from foil to saber, because that's actually something that I really struggle with. Now, leading up to the Sabre event, I sort of chatted with some people who were going to be part of it and warmed up against a couple of others. And the general consensus that I got was that most people, whether they were old or new to fencing, were using this event as a way to ease into the whole saber community as a whole. So most of them didn't have a whole lot of experience, except maybe for one. It was the president of the university's fencing club that had shown up. I remember I warmed up against her and thinking, okay, she could actually be a challenge. This is good. So while I'm there, I eventually realized that they do in fact have a good number of saber referees who would be able to make sure that this whole thing goes smoothly. I'd never seen the head coach specifically ref saber before, but I saw him do it in warm-up and later on in the pools, and I realized that while he may not be the best saber referee out of there, he was certainly competent. Definitely good enough for this tournament. The other one was the saber ref who apparently was pretty familiar with my general area, but I had actually never met him before. He liked to travel a lot. It turned out he was a very good saber ref. The kind of good where you can just go full out and not have to worry about whether or not the ref saw it. You just know that whatever happens, he'll definitely have seen it. So that was good. The third ref that they had was actually a bit unplanned. It was this little kid around 12 years old who had shown up for the foil event. But the thing is, he was studying to become a ref, and he wanted to try to go for all three weapons if he could. He had foil down, and he was studying epee a little bit more just to make sure that he could pass a test. The main problem was saber, because he belonged to the club that this event was happening at. So he'd never really had much saber experience before. I think that was actually the first time he saw a true saber bout in person. So he stayed after the foil event to watch the saber happening, just as a way to sort of see how it went and stuff like that. Now, the original plan was for him to just stay on the sidelines, talk to people, to sort of interpret some of the calls, and to just watch. But later on, he ended up getting involved, which again could only have happened because this was an unsanctioned tournament. So I don't really remember much of what happened in the pools, but that's okay because nothing exciting happened. That's not where this story gets interesting. Where it gets interesting was when we started the first round of direct elimination. I was seeded first, so I got the last seed. So because it looked like my bout would be the easiest to do and the most one-sided, they actually decided to let the little kid who was just watching try it out. I was totally fine with this, and so was my opponent. The DEs start, we go on to the strip, we hook up, and we test, and everything's fine. And I really remember how it started. The kid said, "On guard, ready, fence." We both went forward, and it was a simultaneous. Nothing done. And then it happened again. On guard, ready, fence. We come off the line, and it's a simultaneous. Now, this is pretty common for saber. What I do remember was on the third action, when we came off the line, I did something to ensure that a simultaneous wouldn't happen. My opponent started going back, and I started moving forward. So now I had the attack. I think it happened just before the warning zone when I finished my attack, and he reacted with a counterattack. And there was only one light, but for my opponent. Now that really threw me off, because I was almost certain that I hit, but I didn't get a light. The only other explanation was that the counterattack was so fast that it locked me out. Except that didn't really make a whole lot of sense either. I mean, I was watching the entire time. But it was just 1 point, so I decided to let it go. But then the same thing happened. We get on guard, we go, simultaneous, and then we go again, and the same thing happened. I managed to get the attack off the line, and my opponent starts backing up. And I finish my attack, and it's the same thing. The counterattack gets the light, I don't get anything, and so it has to be given to my opponent, even though I was certain that I hit him in time. So this went on for pretty much the entire first half of the bout. Now, to anyone who isn't familiar, a direct elimination saber bout consists of 15 touches. Now, because saber goes so quickly, there is no time limit. It's just whoever reaches the score limit first. Once one of the fencers gets to 8 touches, then there is a 1-minute break. And only one 1-minute break. So in the first half of the bout, something just feels wrong. Most of my attacks just aren't landing. It's almost always one lights against me, which didn't really make sense. Because, not to brag, but I knew that I was much better than my opponent. And so did my opponent. I had actually fenced him at a different tournament from a different time. He was one of those guys who was rather old and took up fencing only a few years ago, and went because it was super fun, not because he thought he had a chance of winning. BTW, people who do that, people who show up to tournaments, even though they know they're not as fast as other people or not as skilled, they just go because they think, even coming in dead last, this is still super fun. Mad respect to you, you are the glue that holds the fencing community together. So this was what my opponent was. So we both knew what the outcome was going to be, but for some reason the bout wasn't going the way that it should have, and it was odd. Now, to anyone with experience, you might be thinking, oh, well, that sounds like an equipment issue. Except whenever we tested, which, believe me, was often, then it always worked. And it wasn't like he had a dead spot, he literally had a brand new lame. During one of our tests on the strip, he even told me, "This is the first time I've ever used this lame. It's not even been used in practice yet." So there couldn't have been a dead spot, and I couldn't figure out what else was going on. This is partially also because I was honestly starting to panic at this point, because everything just felt off. So we finally get through the first half to the 1 minute rest. And at this point, I'm starting to come apart at the seams. I was fencing someone that I should have won against with ease, and yet here we were at the break, and the score was 8-2 against me. This was just not right. It shouldn't have been happening, but it was. And it was also very unnerving because, normally if the score has that big of a gap, but the difference is because one of the fencers is just much better than the other, then that's one thing. Because you may be losing, but at least you saw how it happened. But in this case, nothing was lining up. I was losing and I had no idea how. It's just my light wasn't coming on whenever I attacked. Now what was funny is most of the other DE bouts were full of people who weren't really used to Saber tournaments in general. And to anyone who has done even a bit of Saber knows that it can get pretty loud. Saber fencers like to scream. In fact, most fencers like to scream, especially when the stakes are high. But because of what was happening to me, I wasn't really, I didn't have a good opportunity to actually scream. Most fencers scream when they attack in the middle, and they think if I act more confident, maybe the ref will consider throwing that simultaneous my way. I didn't like doing that. I only screamed when I got a touch that I was proud of, which obviously had not happened yet. But what was funny was, of the 3 direct elimination bouts that were being fenced in the room, we all got to our 1 minute break at pretty much the same time, and it was really quiet. It was actually pretty odd. And the Saber ref that I mentioned earlier, the one who really, really knew what he was doing, he actually mentioned this to everyone. He said, "It's really quiet right now. Come on, you guys are Saber fencers. You should be ramping it up. You should be making some noise." So the 1 minute break runs out and we go up and test again. And this time, the test fails, indicating that there's a bad connection somewhere. And I was pretty relieved, because for the first time, one of the tests was actually giving the same result as what was happening during the bout. So we start looking over everything, and I finally have the idea to check the back of the body cord, where it connects to the reel. Now, in that area, there was nothing wrong, but then I notice that there's something off about his alligator clip. The alligator clip is supposed to connect to the lame, but it had accidentally been placed underneath the lame, onto the jacket. What this meant was, since it was underneath the lame, it was making a connection whenever his en garde was pretty much perfect, when his torso was perfectly straight. Whenever he leaned forward or leaned back a little too much, then the connection was lost, because the lame would move, but the alligator clip would not, so the connection was broken. This completely explained why all of our tests were working, but none of my attacks were actually arriving. The downside was we only noticed this halfway through the bout, so now the question was, do we reset, or, what do we do here? This was a very uncommon occurrence. We weren't sure. So we looked up the rules and we spoke to the head coach, and basically the consensus was, well, we can't restart. The only thing that can be done is to annul the most recent touch. So basically, after everything was fixed, I now had to fence my way up from 7-2. Not an ideal situation, but I didn't really have a choice, and I knew that I could do it. It's just that, I was pretty annoyed. I didn't blame him for it. He obviously wasn't trying to cheat, and I didn't blame the ref either, because this was kind of a small thing that a lot of new refs don't even think to check, and honestly, most of the time they don't even have a reason to, because fencers usually don't make this mistake. So I don't blame anyone. It was just annoying that I had to deal with this. So I let some of the stress get to my head. We fix the problem, and we start fencing again. We go on to the line. The ref says, on guard, ready, fence. I blasted off that line because I wanted to make sure that everything was working, that everything felt right. And I believe that my attack landed just as he was finishing his initial advance. That's how desperate I was. And the attack arrives, the machine indicates that yes, in fact, I did hit. And I gotta tell you, despite the fact that I had scored twice in the first half, this was the very first attack I'd had the entire bout that actually felt right. So not only was it a touch that I liked, but it was basically an affirmation that everything was working again. It was the first time the entire bout that things felt right. So because of that, and because I had a ton of stress built up from the first half, I turned around and I freaking belted out. Just a massive shout. And what was funny is it was so loud that it took everyone else by surprise, except for the really experienced saber ref, who turned around, pointed at me, and said, "That's what I'm talking about." So, not gonna lie, that felt pretty good. And then the rest of the bout went pretty much the way that you'd expect. I think he scored maybe one more touch before I eventually got to 15 and won. So that's pretty much my story. Just a funny little story of how a very small mistake led to me practically losing my mind over everything that was happening. And I eventually went on to win the tournament. I remember the final bout was up against the president of the fencing club that I mentioned earlier, the only one there who actually had experience. And she was pretty good. It was fun to fence against her, but I actually believe the main difference between us was the fact that I had been polishing my skills against members from my club, so I was constantly practicing, and she had spent maybe the last year teaching her club mates because she was the only one in her club who actually had experience. So I believe that was the main reason that I came out on top. I think if we had spent the same amount of time practicing in the same competitive environment, then I might still have won, but I'm not sure. Anyways, that's the end of the story. I hope you liked it. I'm going to be doing a couple more of these. Most of them, I'll try to make sure that they're things that actually happened to me, but I might reach out and ask other people if they want me to do stories of them. So we'll see how that goes. But thanks for listening, and I'll see you next week. Bye!